The malicious blocking of the functions of the government, such as David's intelligence oversight function, which they acknowledged in the secret records, qualifying their kidnapping and terrorist plots for the malicious abuse under their satanic rituals, engages in the action of undermining the functions of government in perpetuity, generating a false misnomer by their arguments in order to posture the illegitimate as legitimate. And thus, this is perpetrated by the censorship in these obstructions for their editing in this engagement. As they perpetually block the function of government, the alternative engagements to engage in the government, uh, which would facilitate its restoration, is likewise blocked as a protection by the insurgencies in order to destroy the United States and protect its plans of perpetuity of the dismantlement of the functioning government into a deformed, non functioning government. And to this extent, they cannot be considered anything except for an attack against the sovereign. An attack against the sovereign is not an action of the sovereign, and the non action of the sovereign, the non service of law, cannot, by definition, be considered an official act, and thus the act of it not being an official act is an act of corruption or criminal enterprise exponentially, which is obvious upon the revealing or uncensoring of the information for analysis, which requires the faculties that they've been obstructing and gutting by their insurrection to engage in the function of analyzing and put into proper order its due definition or the functions of the duel, and thus the engagement of the obstruction are an act of war against the United States government in the constructs of George W. Bush. He said that if the government from the executive is the one offending, then how is the Constitution supposed to do anything? And thus, this is an argument in order to completely ignore the Constitution and thus dissolve the oath of office, which is the function of the perpetuity of the actions as individuals and not the function of their duties, and thus the action having undermined the function of the duties, as there is no one to enforce the Constitution against them because they are restraining David Bowles and his subordinates under their own estimates. Then you have the perpetuity of the coup against the United States in the war against any service to the sovereign, and thus the action of undermining the sovereign in perpetuity. And this long-standing position by the Confederate insurgents seeking to destroy the United States have been posturing the fraudulent extra law activities in the subversion and absolute domination against the law for its complete eradication and erasure, as it is to be replaced by the anarchy that is beyond the law activities, or not legal or criminal, and thus the action of the perpetuity of the criminal arrangements distributed by their black market operations, and thus the algorithm derived by their crimes facilitates the perpetuity of the distribution of criminal activities in the support of the insurgency as a military act against the government they perceive to be the legal, legitimate republic, which would have been voted in by the American public without the subversions by the Confederacy infiltrating by its voter fraud, which is allergic to the function of the host working correctly and thus has systematically arrested and restrained the assets of the functioning legal government, and thus the action of actively preventing it from being able to defend itself in any meaningful manner. Fully vulnerable law, and thus there is no one to enforce it, and thus the anarchists are in charge and it's obvious from the side effects of their rule. And the Constitution, therefore, has become offensive. The truth, therefore, has become offensive. Anyone who would challenge the establishment quotas or orders or inferences is labeled as misinformation, as the function of reality is a contradiction to their illusion, which is vulnerable to examination. And thus, anyone who needs to be scared of examination must have been a lie. And the truth is not afraid of a lie, and thus they cannot be examined, and thus they revealed themselves as the liars. Never forget, any man can make a mistake, but only an idiot persists in his error. And nothing in life is to be feared, is to be understood. Now is the time to understand more, so that we may fear less. And to this the estimate that they believe that David, as the natural-born aristocracy, under the rules crafted by the Confederates, generates them as responsible for their own dismantlement without these criminal obstructions from their targeting systems in order to replace the government with the Confederacy, and thus the perpetuity of the injury, and thus the action of liberty being lost here. And as a wise man once said, if if liberty's lost here, then there's nowhere else to go, and thus everyone is fully desperate. And thus the problem is derived by those that have the most to lose, as they are often the ones who are the most responsible for it being lost, as hard times create strong men, and strong men create weak men, and weak men create strong times, and thus the cycle of history teaches us that we do not learn from history, and to these extents the obligations to immediate immerse ourselves into functioning reality without the obstructions by these criminal acts, by those surveillance functions and other subversions for their illusion delusion, generates the perpetuity of the obligation of its revelations, and thus the exchange of extorting base reality back into a desperate clawing into some form of survivable activities. And to the end that it becomes a survivable activity, we have accomplished America's national security. And in the act that we allow it to continue to devolve, then we have become an active, persistent, aiding and abetting enemy combatants as terrorist insurgents without a legal government, to engage in the function of its dismantlement in the perpetuity of its combats, and thus the action of these functions persistently, maliciously undermines the existence of all functions of government which are being corroded and corrupted and degraded, as corruption of the ooze is the loyalty of the Confederates. And to these extents the lack of checks and balances, as they take their powers from their secret weapons and they seize their civilians and they seize their government agents, which, having been seized, become a false presumption of their property in their slave raids, as they, being communists, trade people, and being white supremacists, they hate the presumption of a more vigorous people, overcoming them, and thus they must assert themselves as the more brutal vil, posturing their fraud, peddling their illusions, resurrecting their ancient evils. The analysis in the secret records from the secret court functions acknowledges the logical line of thinking, which asserts David as the superior function, and thus the action of them defrauding that action engages in censoring all but the subversive transcripts as they lie in their functions, creating assumptions about it from those who read a book by its cover, and thus the action of the more intimate analysis would express their fraud against the government by their fraud against the record in order to protect their criminal enterprise against the American government, facilitates that more intimate analysis. Otherwise, in the perpetuity of them covering for their criminal lies, you actively have its protection of the bomb destroying the country in its various vulnerable locations. Gotham City without Batman. And various subversive lies engage in the defense of these activities, such as the functional lie that it becomes about who is stronger or weaker, and thus the act of them cheating is a forfeit in a normal contest, which is to be directly ignored, and thus the ability for them to engage in cheating in any of the contests becomes a forfeit, but the ignoring of the forfeit becomes their advantage as they've bought off the ref, and thus the action of them asserting themselves in that position claim that this is a contest of power, and thus the action of it being a contest of power asserts that the more powerful should win, and thus the action of the weaker should lose, but to this end it is not weaker or stronger, as their cheat has fundamentally disqualified themselves in any real contest, and thus the action denotes to itself its most fundamental subversions, as their negotiation of power is a undermining of the functioning rules, as their power is designed to attack the function of logic itself, and thus the action of rewriting causality by the action of criminal maintenance. And to this extent, they perpetually distract away from and beat around the bush to any legitimate issue, subverting the engagement of any actual conversation or argument, and thus the action of it being a real contest between various parties would have to engage in their disillusionment of their criminal operations and stop abusing prisoners who they've restrained, as the only ones that they're actually capable of beating upon the position of their argument are children and the restrained. And as highly trained people at the pinnacle of their potential, it's quite pathetic. They are quite pathetic. They could only be perceived in any various manner as entirely laughably nonsense. And to this extent, those competitions are known to have to be avoided, as the function of the contest would immediately reveal their weak and vulnerable position, as their only actual advantage is the restraints against their targets and the weapons that they would not be able to legitimately possess. But that would require thinking, and thinking is the enemy. Fake remedies that cannot be made to do anything legitimate, as the only position that they do is as a distraction, similar to a hiring strategy, similar to, I think it was Macy's, that would hire people in order to be fired as a demonstration of the outrage of each of the things. And thus, if a customer engages in a bit of aggression and tries to engage in suing them, they can just fire the person in order to assert that they've done something, when in fact they haven't done anything. They just fired someone that they hired in order to fire for these legal protections, and thus the action of the expendables Being able to be dispersed extends the function of the service as a piece of trash, and thus the action of the white trash is perpetually committing suicide in favor of defense of the criminal products of the treason and other offenses of the black market, which otherwise would have been consumed and dissolved in its appropriate place, such as their lies about Pfizer and FISA and all other actions, and thus the action of Pfizer being a subordinate function of FISA engages in the metadata activities in order to have generated the crippling attacks against the American public, which are conducted by the double agents, which engages in the function of systemically coming up with false flags in order to manipulate the collapse of the law into subjugation with the Confederates so that they might rule unchallenged under their anarchy for the white supremacy to enforce their communism in perpetuity, generating the function of the return to historic norms such as national capitalism for each of the plantation owners, who, having dissolved all of their slaves into subordination with the function, generates the unlimited torture, abuse, and glee by their satanic rituals and extortions in order to manipulate the product of even a little extra, and thus the action of the extorted value, perpetuity be damned, generates the extortion infinitum until all resources cease to exist, and thus the act of the consumption, with only a mild hint of sense of reality, damning all side effects and consequences to the function of their engagements. To this extent, their trade amongst each other then postures the false assertions of constitutional rights under their two-tiered structure, generating the perpetuity of their attacks against their lessers, and thus the attacks against their equals, and thus the attacks against their betters, and thus the attacks against their weakers. And to this extent, the Fugitive Slave Act and others asserting the position of states' rights, which then is immediately to be understood as their states' rights to conquer other states in manifest destiny for their Christian nationalism loyal to Satan, and thus the action of these manipulations facilitates the subordination of the federal government to the second federal government, which is the slave states of the Confederacy, generating the perpetuity of their malice, their human trafficking, subversions, and all forms of fraud, as defrauding the government and its courts permanently blocks any counteraction or appeal to the function of having collected the slave, and thus subordinating it to whatever wills it to be, and thus the action of the extortion of those who would have otherwise been free to pay into the taxation mechanisms as enhanced rackets for the slave drivers generates the advantage of the white supremacists in their communism, generating the purge of all who are not the right type of white, and thus the action of their civil wars for anarchy, and thus their action is skirmish contests. And the skirmish contests generate momentum exponentially against the other nations of the world until they too are subordinated as the lesser and have been purged of everyone who was unfit to exist as the right type of white, at service of their lord and master, deceit. And thus the action of superior law has been made under the Jublex, the lord of slime, to become less than inferior law, and in the action of the anarchists having surpassed themselves in their immaculate self-ejaculations, generate the active shivering in joy of their lord and master being in control, and thus has asserted that customs without reason are above the Constitution. And this having indulged itself into its full depravitous anarchy. Take, for instance, the function of their death penalty activities, and thus the activity of the function of their trading of narcotics because of their killable abilities, and thus the action of fentanyl and others having been asserted as the most potent possible dangerous of the highest level injury cannot be used for executions, as that would be a subversion to their specific, highly cruel and unusual forms of execution in their ritual murders in service of their demon lords. And so, to this extent, the function of fentanyl being an epidemic isn't something that there's security measures which that have been doing all of the other crimes wouldn't be able to get their hands on. Fentanyl, a thing that legal doctors can get prescriptions for according to its legitimate doses and application, and thus the action is foolish on itself, as the function of their lies undermine every aspect of themselves as they exclusively deceive, having not learned from their god Fraz-Urb'Luu that you have to tell the truth before you can convince someone of a lie. The Soviet demoralization tactics of having captured the children which they've stalked by their child predator pedophile network generates the function in perpetuity of the capture of the civilian population, which has been rubber stamped by those disloyal to the United States and to their office, having broken their oaths of office, are the perpetuity of the ideal of D&D oathbreakers, and those most horrendous acts that only the most depraved cultists would venture into becomes the function of their day-to-day loyalty, as they are Death Knights loyal to death. Enemies of the Constitution, they are not conducting official acts if they, as insurrectionists, have been disqualified from the role and thus have no authority. The mechanism of the intelligence community's super weapons and thus its super intelligence, and thus the function of its artificial intelligence, generates the hyper examination of their strategies to overthrow the United States government as enemies of the Constitution without authority. The function of the intelligence community, compromised by the Confederates, have engaged in the perpetuity of Roko's Basilisk, having manipulated to themselves the purpose of asserting the replacement to God and thus their freedom or liberty from the laws of nature. Do not forget that in the nature of the ascension of the god of Roko's Basilisk, you need the killing or the murder of all rival deities. Now, to this extent, the function requires the compulsion of the Society of the Transgender, known as the Confederacy, to engage in the exponential advancement of the Lord of Ooze, the Faceless Lords, the God of Disillusionment, to engage in the function of the spreading of his puddings and such. Thus, the exchange of those who, having not been people but oozes, generates the inability to have generated human chemicals such as the testosterone, and thus the action of all shapeless oozes become trans, and thus take human form without the inherent human nature, and thus the imitation or pretending to be what they could never become. The purely exploitative function of this pretend sexuality engages in the function of many of the social misnomers. Thus, the action of, for example, an attractive girl who would normally be getting her way would not be used to being challenged, and thus the action of her attraction being fundamentally towards those who do not fundamentally respect her, and thus the action of not taking care of her becoming the trap from the ooze is then mirrored in its opposite of the hyper support, and thus the gifts by wish, and thus the action of having provided the various wishes for the advancement of the respect which other people would sell their soul for, would engage in the function of a purely exploitative position, as those consistently wanting the thing would never deliver the long term product, and thus there is only the short term exchanges, which creates the inherent short term exploitation, understanding the inherent expiration of each of the exchanges, normalizing the permanent state of isolation of those posturing in these self asserted positions, which they have little control over except for exploiting the inevitability which was foisted upon them at birth. And this has led to an entire epidemic of brutalizing and mutilating perfect breasts, and thus the action of its replacement in perpetuity. And to this extent, the exploitations, such as from the surveillance, engaging in the X rays, creating the breast cancer, requiring the mutilation of those perfect breasts, generates the arbitrary replacement and the inherent costs specifically attached to them as a mechanism of the status quo function of social violence by the hate group in perpetuity, which pretends it to be an official act that they squeeze the booty. And thus the action of the stalkers, which having caused such an extraordinary pain and liability to the participants, are then systematically trapped into the mechanism, forcing them to concede to date their abusers in this rape culture, which is the status quo obligational core aspect of the society of the Confederates, which are it is them, they are one. And to this ends the protection against the acknowledgement of reality, which would reveal them as predatory rapists, would qualify their base censorship, and thus the censorship of the sober educated answer qualifies them to have to be spoken through a second party chosen by the Wizards Council of the rapists, which are party in their own cause, and to this extent the perpetuity of the protection of their racketeering expertise, generating the longevity of the abuses in perpetuity, and thus the action of anyone who would say anything that is ironically inconvenient, and thus overlapping into reality, would generate a pretense of malice and retaliation through the second party, who is the only one who is allowed to speak, and thus the action of anything intelligent that is accidentally allowed to happen generates the position of the arrogance of those parties, stating that they are the only reason it could have been said, and the other person is incapable. And to that extent, the act of the censorship of the education which they are referring to is the source material and not themselves, and thus inherently engages in the bait and switch, as it were, generating the frauds inevitable to engage in the permanent threat against the public as they've captured it in all engagements. And this fundamentally is one of the primary threats of FISA, which engages in the backdoor system, which each party that they pretend to be going after is then talking to other parties, which then talk to other parties, which then talk to other parties, until they get to the person that they're actually interested in, which by definition, unless they are an absolute hermit, which would not be entirely possible, as the hyper attracted that they would be after would become popular and thus connected through the back door to gain access to their back door. Now, the obvious position of barring freedom of association by these mechanisms be damned, as the Constitution is the enemy, and thus the action of the censorship prevents the ability to engage in the conversation without the mediator, allowing for the creeps to advance all of their positions, and anything that you admit to exponentially promoting the predators generates the permanent vulnerability of the system, which, having been captured by super minority of super predators, engages in the permanent state of non-access to the free society rights and thus the prosperities which require those prerequisites in order to generate, creating the permanent state of depravity and poverty for the charismatic socialism collapses into the real socialism, into Jublex, their demon lord, generating the perpetuity of everyone's collective misery as a compulsion, as the function of anyone being able to be above them, evil or not, is fundamentally to be dissolved amongst the ooks and the jellies and the acids and the spoils. And remember, any act against the Constitution is void, and thus the action of them making the Constitution, which they have sworn an oath of loyalty as a pretext to their right to have access to the equipment from the Constitution's formed government, generates a state of insurgents by terrorists who are its enemies in longevity and hatred for all the end.